Hong Kong is a hub for the illegal wildlife trade. Some of it is used in Hong Kong. A lot of it is going on to other parts of Asia, in particular China. So we thought about how we could get our judges and our prosecutors to understand the impact of wildlife crime and to take it more seriously when they come to determine the appropriate sentence. So that's where the idea comes from. And you will know, I'm sure, that who can be a victim is an evolving social construct. So we've had very traditional ideas of who is a victim. A victim is the person who is wounded in a fight from decades ago. Now there are more progressive ideas about who can be a victim, perhaps somebody who witnessed that event, perhaps the family members of the victim can also argue that they have been affected by the crime, and the judge will take that into account. And in criminology, particularly in green criminology, there's a recognition that animals can be victims, not just human species. And this is particularly so with wildlife, and that not just individual animals or even species groups can be victims, but even ecosystems can be victims. So that is really the intellectual basis on which the idea was formulated, but it's a very practical project. It's essentially incredibly simple. What we're doing is explaining the impact of wildlife crime in robust scientific literature, but in a way that can be accessible, understood, and translated by legal professionals who sometimes don't have any scientific background at all. So the idea of the species victim impact statements is to make sure that they do understand those things. So we look through the science. I have an ecologist that works with me, and we think about what the important things are that we need to tell the prosecutor preparing the case and the judge who will hear the case. And we distill those down into a format that can be readily understood by all the parties. We had hoped originally that they might be handed up as a document to the court, but the Hong Kong Charter for Victims still constrains itself to human victims. So we haven't been able to do that. But what we have got is a situation where the judges have been trained now in the species victim impact statements, and they refer to them. And if they're not getting the information they want from the prosecutors, they ask about it. So we have a much more educated judiciary. In fact, I did a lot of video training for them, which they can watch at their leisure, which is a good way to train a judge because they're busy people. We have a website. You can have a look at it if you're interested in seeing more about the way we formulate the victim impact statements. But essentially, what I do, because I'm the lawyer in the mix, is make sure that they are admissible. Because you can't give something to a judge that isn't reliable, that you haven't checked the sources carefully for, and that is exaggerating or perhaps emotive. So what we do is we distill the science into a form that's easy for the judges to understand, but is robust and is reliable, so that if they're going to use it in a judgment, and some of them do quote verbatim from our victim impact statements in their judgments, if they're going to use it, they know that it won't end up with them being appealed. So it's important that we're very careful about what goes into these victim impact statements. We target species that are commonly in trade, so we look at the most traded species through Asia. We have 150 victim impact statements now. We started off with 30, and it's grown to 150. We're always adding to it. We are involved with a lot of the NGOs that work around Asia, and they come to us sometimes and say, we need one for a particular species that you don't have. Can you draft one for us? And we have done that. And then we update them because the scientific literature is always changing. And there are 9 species of pangolin now, who knew? So we have had to amend our species victim impact statements for that species, for those species, when they are updated by science. We make sure that we include certain things that we think are really important for the judges to know about. So we have a certain format that we always follow. Obviously, we put the CITES listing because that's important. That will generally affect what kind of charge you're dealing with and what the penalties will be. But we think even more important, we put the IUCN Red List view on that particular species because the judges will sometimes be confused. We had a saga horn case, which I'll talk about in a few moments, which the judges were confused by because that's only a CITES 2 listed species, and yet it's a critically endangered species. They couldn't understand why the IUCN had a different tag on it until we explained to them that it was because there was still some legal trade, but it was controlled for particular purposes. So we do include the categorization in conservation. We look at the ecosystem impacts as the result of removing that species. We explain it's not just the target species that is impacted when an animal is taken for illegal wildlife trade. There will be other animals that are also affected. There will be perhaps problems caused to the habitat. A good example is cyanide fishing for humphead wrasse or large groupas in Indonesia and the Philippines, where you are bleaching the corals and also affecting some of the smaller fish when those animals are taken. We talk about the concept of keystone species and the potential tipping points when your large predator is taken out of your ecosystem, how that will impact the animals below. We talk about community impacts, so the human impact. People are perhaps losing food security, fishermen that are relying on that source for their own families to eat. Perhaps there's an impact on your tourism industry as a result of those animals being targeted for illegal wildlife trade. Now that might seem a step perhaps too far for a judge to take into account when he or she is thinking about a wildlife crime case, but if you think about drug trafficking, judges do take social impact into account. So you just need to explain it to a judge in such a way that they will come with you in your legal argument. And we help our prosecutors to do that with the training that we give them. We don't just train judges, we also train prosecutors and sometimes enforcement bodies, police and forestry officials as well. We talk about population depletion and future concerns as a result of perhaps juveniles being taken before they breed. It's obvious what the result is going to be there. Juveniles, unfortunately, are often targeted for illegal wildlife trade. 2 reasons. One of them is they're more attractive to collectors if they're being caught for the pet trade. And secondly, of course, is transport. You can fit more in if you have smaller sized animals. So for smugglers, that's an economic incentive. We talk about food chain effects. If you take out the prey of an endangered species, then you make it harder for that endangered species to survive. So we explain to judges that this is not just a single species being impacted, but a wider group. We look at the monetary value on the black market. Too often, judges will say, well, it was only going to make the poacher that much, therefore there's not really an impact here. We explain how much that animal would have been worth if it had got beyond the seizure and had got to wherever the destination country was. Because some of these animals, as we'll see with the pangolin in a moment, increase in value very much as they move through borders. We talk about evidence of laundering of species. We'll get shipments where there'll be falsehood in the documentation, so legal trade will be mixed with illegal trade in the hope that the customs officers don't recognize it. We've got sometimes wild animals being laundered through legal captive breeding facilities and how you can detect that. All of these things are important because judges too often have defense counsel stand up in front of them and tell absolute falsehood stories in order to try to minimize the sentence to their client. And you must have a prosecutor who understands where those animals have come from and how they could have got to where they've got to in the illegal wildlife trade patterns, which we understand and we put into our victim impact statements. We talk about invasive species concerns. It's not just an animal, it's an animal that potentially, if it had been abandoned or released or lost, could have had an impact on your local biodiversity. Judges need to understand that. We talk about disease and pathogen concerns. Of course, illegal wildlife trade, there's no quarantine. We've become more aware, thanks to COVID, of zoonosis. And illegal wildlife trade, of course, is a really worrying method for zoonosis to spread. We also talk about forensic testing available to assist prosecutors. I normally give this talk to prosecutors and forestry police in Southeast Asian countries where there is also in the program somebody from a conservation's forensic lab, because that needs to be explained as well. And in our species victim impact statements, we do give tips as to what kinds of conservation tests can be done to support prosecution work. So DNA testing, carbon dating, these kinds of tests that can assist a prosecutor to get over the line when they're trying to bring a successful prosecution. And not every one of these will be relevant. Not every one of these different areas that we cover in every species victim impact statement is going to be relevant for the case. But the idea is that the prosecutor can pick and choose from the information that he or she needs in order to best present their case to the court. So let me give you a quick example of one, and obviously I've just chosen some bits of it to highlight, but this is the Sunda pangolin, one of the Asian species of pangolin, and this animal is in trade mainly to China and Vietnam for traditional Chinese medicine and as a food animal. The scales are the things that are used in the traditional Chinese medicine. As you can see, the seizures of these animals are increasing. I mean, this is despite the fact that all pangolin species are CITES 1 listed. They have been since 2017, but in that time, the worldwide seizures have tripled in size. And you can see there the number of pangolins that it would take to create 1 ton of scales. And we're seeing horrendous shipments in Hong Kong, in Singapore, 10, 12 tons of these animals. And for 1,000 kilos, you're looking at 2,777 pangolins. And it was Sam that helped us to get that data, so thank you, Sam. And that is, when you explain those kinds of numbers to a judge, the light comes on. And they start to realize that what they're dealing with is not a few animals. What they're dealing with is a very serious form of organized crime, because what you will see in many of these shipments is mixed species. And you'll see shipments of Asian pangolin mixed with African pangolin. And when you have that, and you have that kind of organization in criminal networks, then you start to see that this is a much more serious form of crime than perhaps the judge was going to consider it to be. And you can see there the values. The values are much higher once the animal gets to its destination country. You can see there the values for the meat and the values for the scales. And the processed scales, of course, are worth much more because that's what's used in traditional Chinese medicine. So we make sure that the judges aren't deceived, that they aren't given a false story that these animals are not really valuable and that they are therefore not worthy of a serious deterrent sentence. We talk about the ecosystem impacts. The effect on ecosystems, the scientists say, is not 100% clear yet, but we do know they eat hundreds of thousands of ants and termites, and they're in their lifetime, and therefore, if they do go extinct, we're not really sure how that is going to affect the ecosystem. They're also prey for other endangered species. They're prey for tigers and pythons in their habitats. So these animals are of value. Whether we care about them as animals or not, we need to care about them as part of our ecosystem. And that's something that we try to make clear to judges, that it's not just a matter of whether you like animals or not. It's got nothing to do with your assessment of the case. What you need to understand is why this animal matters in the ecosystem. We talk about the welfare concerns for these animals. So for pangolin, they curl up in a ball when they're caught. They don't have teeth. They generally stay curled up in the sacks whilst they're transported. They suffer, sometimes they're stored in the back of vehicles where they suffer from heat. They're certainly not fed. They'll dehydrate. The mothers won't be able to feed the babies if they've been caught together during the transport. And then they're taken to the descaling houses if that's the purpose of the trade. And sometimes if they're sold live as meat, then they'll be injected with liquid flour or other kinds of chemicals to make them heavier for a better price. They're also sometimes injected with sedatives to ensure that they're not detected when they're going across borders. So these animals do suffer in the way that they are treated. Sometimes they'll be seized with injuries to their legs from snares. Sometimes they'll have been caught by dogs and they'll show bite wounds. All of these things are very concerning, obviously, from a welfare perspective. So we try to get judges to take that into account when they give the sentencing. So, disease and pathogen concerns, I mean, I don't need to point out those, of course. Let me show you the kind of impact this has had. I've got 3 minutes left. In 2014, before we started the project, there were 2 Egyptian nationals who were caught at the Hong Kong International Airport with over 100 CITES Appendix 1 and 2 listed tortoises in their suitcase. They got off with a complete suspended sentence and a fine that was about 1% of what those animals were worth on the black market. And then again in 2014, there was a man caught smuggling into Hong Kong 10 ploughshare tortoises. That is the most endangered tortoise in the world. There's less than 100 left in the wild. They're a Madagascan tortoise. In Madagascar, they are completely protected, and yet they are very, very valuable on the international trade for rare tortoise collectors. They're worth about $1,000 per centimetre of shell that they grow. So very high value. This guy had 10 in his suitcase, and he was sentenced to 6 weeks imprisonment. So those were the cases before the Species Victim Impact Statement project that really galvanized us to start this. And we see a complete change after the judges are trained in Species Victim Impact Statements and why they should take these crimes seriously. In 2019, a judge dealt with almost the same species, same numbers, very, very similar case. This time, the smuggler was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 12 months for animal cruelty. It was the first time animal cruelty had ever been actually attached to a wildlife crime smuggling case, and a judge had seriously taken it into account when he calculated his sentence. So he quoted directly from the Species Victim Impact Statements. He pointed out that the animals were going to go extinct in the next 45 years if something wasn't done, that the Madagascan people had national laws to protect these animals, and Hong Kong shouldn't be letting down the rest of the world by letting this kind of smuggling continue to occur. And it's gone all the way up to our Court of Appeal. We had the first case go up to the Court of Appeal involving wildlife in many years. It was appealed in early 2021. It involved 50 kilos of Sega horn from Russia, which came through Hong Kong for traditional Chinese medicine trade. This gentleman was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. He appealed, and the Court of Appeal said, I'm sorry, looking at the species victim impact statement, you're lucky that we didn't give you more. If you keep appealing these cases, then watch where we will go. So it's been very successful. As I said, we do offer them to NGOs all around the world for nothing. All we ask is that you let us know if you use them and how they affected your case outcome. We just want to make sure that they're having impact. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Amanda.